Let me do that too. I better kill mine.
Uh,
All right.
Hello, can everyone see us?
I don't know. You might have to refresh because I have. Let's see. Yep. Refresh. I'll tell them.
If you're unable to see us, make sure you hit the refresh button. We are live now.
Okay.
Cool. All right. Welcome to Little House Off the Griddy's first installment in our live stream series called Informative Off-Grid Conversations. We have a very special guest this week, or this month. His name is Santi. You want to give a little brief overview of your background, Santi?
Yeah, how you doing, guys? My name is Santi. I'm actually originally from California, but I have a little tiny homestead in the rural Ozarks of Missouri. I'm currently back in California on a crisis response. My background, how we got connected, is square foot gardening, biointensive farming, and also permaculture principles. So since back in about 2006, I've been pursuing more of an off-grid lifestyle. I wanted to get out of the fast-paced life of California, and I transitioned to Missouri around that time. And that was, it's kind of a long-winded story, but it was just seeing the signs of the times, the population density, the cost of living. I was working in emergency medical services, private contract security service, and I just saw that, man, these cities are crazy in California, and it's just not sustainable. And that's when I started to pursue the farming and the gardening. It started with gardening, and it's like I said, it's a long-winded story, but got really connected in Missouri with a lot of amazing teachers, and that's kind of what has brought me here to this place and in this conversation.
Awesome. And what we're going to be talking about today, everybody, is it's zone planning for a grocery store garden. This is a philosophy that Santi has kind of developed and pieced together over from multiple different philosophies and techniques in gardening, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So let's just jump right into it, and I'll kind of give you the floor and kind of explain to us what is zone planning and how is it beneficial to, can it be beneficial to people's gardens?
Yeah, I think that what you see right now is there's a large movement of people that are having a strong conviction, whether they have the financial resource, whether they have the skill, they just have a strong conviction to get out of the city, get less dependent on big corporation, big grocery, and get back to nature. And so what I've seen since 2006 up to today is that with that, it gets overwhelming, right? And so what permaculture teaches is a strategic zone plan. Usually those zones are from 0 to 5. Now that can even seem like a lot of information sharing it. So what I'd like to do is kind of take it back to the basics of why I see that there's a great need right now, especially for people making that transition, to have understanding on what a holistic homestead needs to be successful, sustainable, to meet a lot of their caloric needs. And that happened. My first teacher ever was when I got to Missouri. I was dying of a disease, and I got networked with a religious group, a church group, and a nutritionist. And he connected me with a man to learn about gardening, amazing enough. And this man was actually quadriplegic. And so he had a brilliant mind. He did not have use of his appendages, but he had a lot of information to share. And he hired me to be his gardener, his personal gardener. Now, the interesting thing about his gardening method is it was square foot gardening, and it was close to the front door. And what he saw is that because of his disability, that he had to design strategically, because his wife at the time was taking care of him, all his medical needs, and also having to steward the garden. So that's where I started to learn strategic design from the very beginning of how are we going to design our homestead in such a way that can grow with us in age. It's our retirement plan, right? Starting with the gardening methodology. If the gardening takes a lot of labor input, how is that going to be sustainable when we get older, right?
Right.
If the gardening takes heavy machinery, what happens if we don't have that machinery access or the access to the parts to fix that machinery? And that's kind of where from the very beginning, whether it was divine intervention or grace, I started to see that the design methodology that I was learning was countercultural. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So it was not only countercultural, it could be offensive to people that have studied other methods. And so I want a disclaimer right when I'm saying this is I'm not critiquing large scale farming. I don't think there's time to critique anybody growing food. So whatever method you're using, I think it's beautiful right now. Okay. I think there should be balance. And what I feel my mandate specifically is to really encourage people in that strategy of zone planning, but really thinking it through. Will this garden or this design grow with me in age? If I end up in a situation where I'm disabled, can I still benefit and can I still find enjoyment in the design? And so that's where it started with the strategic design of gardening, but the method was countercultural in the sense it was all raised bed, no-till, square foot garden methodology. And we had such success. So in front of his apartment that was handicap accessible, we began to plant, in 6 inches of beautiful soil mix that was basically a 4 to 5 blend compost, peat moss, and vermiculite. And we would grow vertical. And I think it was something like in a 15 by 15, we had 5,200 pounds of food. You know what I mean? So that's where I say, like, and I feel the dialogue needs to go in that direction specifically for a lot of people, is have a understanding of blueprint planning before you leave, especially if you're in a season of wait for finances, or you're still in your 9-to-5 job collecting the resources. This is the perfect time to study. And there's a lot of tools online too for permaculture zone planning, your house being your zone 0, and then the larger acreage going all the way to zone 5. And it's a long-winded kind of explanation. And you really have to see the pictures, I think, to better understand it in the videos and the tutorials, especially the stuff that we've done. But I think it can still be a good dialogue,
Absolutely. Can you kind of briefly discuss what each of these zones kind of represent and how people can maybe start implementing something along the lines of this zone planning or this square, what did you call it?
Square yard gardening.
Square yard gardening.
Yeah. So
square foot gardening.
Square foot gardening.
Right now, so you guys see, let's go off what you're going through right now, right? You get to this rural location in ways you bring out your trailer to that location. So you have a shelter, right? And and you also are looking at what are the most important things in that shelter to keep you warm and sustainable. So zone 0 is really important, especially if you're going to go to a rural off-grid situation. That's your zone 0. That's your home center design. And how are you going to make that shelter? It doesn't need to be luxurious, but you need to be sustainable at your zone 0. And that's priority for a lot of people. That's why I really like, RV trailers, especially if you're going to be moving. Because if you don't understand the contour of your land and also the design of your land, you really need to have a house that moves with you, right? So you get out there and you realize, okay, wait, water settles here. Or this isn't the best place for a home center. At least we can move our home and watch the land for a whole year in the seasons while we have shelter, right? And while we're comfortable enough. So I would say zone 0 right now for a lot of people should be priority, especially if they're looking at transition and they don't have a lot of expendable income to do it, is to have a home that moves with them, right? You can see that a lot with the van life movement right now. Is a lot of them are transitioning into tiny homesteading, like a tiny house and land purchase. And so their focus in the beginning is always that home center. So I would say that is zone 0. And then to elaborate on that, I actually have blueprints that it can explain it really good. And I think that would be the best way to do it in the future, is to post it up. But from zone 0 to zone 1, you transition into your kitchen garden. Everything that needs in the zone 1 is everything that needs a lot of management, right? So you want to have high calorie return without a lot of calorie burn. Does that make sense? If you're out on
this sounds
I like that philosophy.
This sounds like this square foot gardening and zone planning is really and I think I read this on your website, a way of conserving energy.
Right. Absolutely. And that's why, again, the overall plan, it will make a lot of sense to people if they get to see the zones. And I don't have the technological advancement to show you right now on here, but I really focus on, because I serve mostly disabled and elderly and people with inexperience that are uneducated in gardening. I really focus on just the zone 0 and zone 1. I have trained under guys like Sean Jes, biointensive gardening, similar to square foot gardening, that they have models where they're growing a vegan's caloric needs They have a model of 2,000 square feet to 4,000 square feet where they're growing all of one person's vegan caloric needs, and they've documented using the scientific method. I've seen it. I've been on their farms. So zone 0 and zone 1 are most important to me. Now, for a permaculture, a naturalist, consultant, usually they would focus on the latter zones, right? The food forest and hunting and gathering, more like a nomadic, right? My concern with that is when you have an understanding of the current depletion of the woodlands, the mismanagement of raw renewable resources in our nation, right, in the United States. When you get realistic, you can see that that's not enough with our current woodlands and the mismanagement to sustain calorie needs. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So my hope is, even in this dialogue, is just to really focus on zone 0 and zone 1. Zone 1 being your kitchen garden, all those things that need micromanagement and heavy management, meaning you're checking on them daily. But if you're doing that properly just with your kitchen garden, you can meet the majority of your calorie needs, not 100%. But do I believe it's possible to be in the 50 to 80%? Absolutely, with strategic kitchen garden design. Does that make sense?
Right.
So I think in this dialogue, we should focus in on that zone 0 in the kitchen garden, because somebody that's new, they can really do this. You know, when I went into square foot gardening, I had master gardener yields my first year. And all I did was learn from one man and read the book and follow the principles, right? And then I started to advance my training in John Jevons' grow biointensive method, and I had the same type of yield. And so that's kind of the goal, is to say, how much acreage is needed to sustain one person's calorie needs? What do you think? What would you think?
Less than a half acre, quarter acre.
So that's okay. So that's where most of my studies started out on. Is I was like, okay, if people don't have access to woodlands, or they can't buy large acreage, what is an overall understanding of what a person needs? So the United Nations says, and we have to test everything the United Nations says, but they've run prototypes. So even with meat eaters, and they say about 0.54 acres, like what you're saying, about a half an acre, right? And people will argue with that, obviously, and there's going to be different, opinions. But if we understand that, okay, this is what the scientists are saying, 0.54 acres. And then I've studied all the way down to 0.09 acres, right? Less than a quarter of an acre. You have guys that have prototypes. You don't see a lot of this stuff on the news, but they have prototypes where they're meeting caloric needs. So we can take that information and say, hey, if we're going to design strategically, let's take that into consideration from the very beginning, right? And not only should we take it into consideration, we should look at the biointensive, the square foot gardening, the high intensity, raised bed gardening methods that we can keep close to our door. So in our homestead design, we can meet our calories, and we have that understanding before we build out anything. You see so many, when in the homestead movement, there's so much amazing videos on YouTube, but they get so overwhelmed and it almost becomes fantasy, right? So they have all these ideas, and when they get out on land, a lot of projects are started, but not a lot of success and sustainability.
That comes from a lot of the pre-planning and the strategic planning that you're talking about, and maybe trying to do things a little too big, like we did at first, than was necessary.
Right. I mean, a lot of first purchases are large earth moving equipment, tractors, and I'm not condemning any of this, but it's saying how many people are given the opportunity to even consider, hey, what is our zone plan and what is our goal here, right? And I looked all over to try to find information on how much land mass is needed to sustain one person's calorie needs, and it's not very easy to find, and there's all these different opinions. But there are teachers out there that share the information, but they're not that popular. You know what I mean? So I think that's most critical, because ultimately, when you talk to homesteaders, they have varying reasons to get off grid, but they're all coming back to is they want to grow the majority over their calorie needs, right? So it's I think that is the goal, and I do believe there is actual, I wouldn't say standardized, because everybody has different geographic regions and climate zones, right? Pest pressures and skill sets. But I would say that I would want, if I'm thinking from the mind of a good shepherd, I would want at least, 0.39 to half an acre per family member in my design. strategically, right?
And that could perform, and you're saying that would provide up to 80% of the caloric intake needs of a person.
Easy, but we have to also look at, some of the things like salts, fats. You have to look at some of these things we're still going to have dependency on. But I think ultimately what I believe we're going through this as humanity is to reconsider how we design, right, our own homes, our own neighborhoods, how our cities are designed, right? And rethink design to say, what is the carry capacity of our home, right? For right now, so what is the carry capacity of your land? And people will be like, well, what does that mean, carry capacity? Some of this language may be foreign. I would say, if you got in an elevator, would you want to get on an elevator with an elephant? Probably not, right? I mean, it's corny.
Right, probably not.
Would you want to get on a boat that had already breached carry capacity? Would you want to get onto an airplane that already breached carrying capacity? No, you wouldn't. Would you want your family on that plane? No, you would never let them. Now, if you study like where I'm right now in the Central Valley of California, in my opinion, most of the cities have breached carry capacity, meaning that the population of the city cannot be sustained by the arable landmass where the people are. They're crammed, right? Multitudes of people, thousands of people crammed in 1 square mile. And so that's what I think we have to take into consideration just in free flow conversation and dialogue of, hey, how are we planning our land? And if we have 20 acres, how many people can this acreage truly sustain?
Right.
Are those fair questions you think that we should be asking?
Absolutely. And we have firsthand knowledge of seeing what you're talking about the cities being past the capacity. You have people lined up in the streets without homes and without the ability to eat. And that right there in itself shows that the cities are over capacity.
Right. So yeah, exactly, man. And that's why I'm like, I want to just stay on the focus of zone 0 and 1, because I know just by us talking, people can research the other zones of design. But if you have zone 0 and zone 1 wrong, for example, this is why I'm encouraging so many people to get out of the cities, okay? Because I have an understanding now that I served 6 years in the inner city of Kansas City doing garden beds in the inner city, taking over vacant land lots, right? And then I began to see that the population density of the city, right? Not only population density, crime because of people being crammed in too small space, food desert, people not having access to clean food. I was like, this is no longer sustainable. Yes, I saw a worth in investing in those blighted areas, but the design of the city, the population density, the controlling politics, it was not sustainable. And in my opinion, it was time to start calling people out of the cities, right? And so I can go into any city now and I can understand, is this worthy of my time investment? Well, absolutely, it's worthy to invest time in the people that are confined to the city. But my opinion now is to encourage them to come out of the cities. That's where I want to spend my time. Now, I'm not saying that I still serve in emergency services. I'm currently on a deployment on a crisis response team, Northern California and Bay Area. And so my heart is to serve these people and open up opportunities to get them out of these cities. Quick, a little bunny trail on that is right before COVID started, I actually came back here and I was partnering to build tiny villages for the homeless and displaced, especially after the fires. And we had the blueprints. We had understood the population density, right? And our focus was catering to a small group of displaced, disabled, 65 plus, and veterans, right? And what happened is we presented the blueprints. There's funding, and then there's this desire because there would be more funding or more resources coming in from the state if you cram more people into the area, right? So an original vision of having maybe 12 to 20 people on 2 acres now turns into 120, right? You see? So I knew immediately
not sustainable.
And I can tell you, working in protective services and emergency medical services, I stayed until the point where when COVID hit, then it got even worse and they started to cram more people into it, where it became what originally was going to be a beautiful tiny home villages with independent gardens, dwarf fruit tree orchards, ponds, and all this stuff now became, in my opinion, in ways, an encampment of concentration, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we don't want to do that in design. And that's what I want. I really hope if anybody takes something of importance from this dialogue is to say, I need to look through the eyes of a good shepherd. If I'm a good shepherd, would I take 30 head of cattle and confine 30 head of cattle to 1 acre indefinitely? I
No.
wouldn't do that. What happens to 30 head of cattle confined to 1 acre within a day even? If that acre's lush or that pasture's lush, they will consume that pasture very quickly, right? So
Mm-hmm.
within 30 days, you have an accumulation of manure, right? You have sickness and disease because they're standing in the manure. You're going to have to bring input feed, right, to sustain them because there's no feed left. And so when I describe that acre, I believe I'm very practically describing most cities, right? Where
Mm-hmm.
people have become sedentary, confined. Those who govern over them, those who shepherd over them, encourage the confinement for selfish gain, right? And so I believe in our dialogue, we have to consider that. We have to have different eyes, different perspective, and say, how am I designing not only for myself, how am I designing for my beautiful bride, my future children, or their children? And we can take that into consideration from the very beginning in our blueprint. And so I hope that wasn't too long-winded, man. Was that too out there? Or?
No, it's fine.
Yeah.
So maybe we can discuss a little bit or dialogue a little bit about what zone 1 and zone 0. Well, we kind of talked about what zone 0 is, but maybe a little bit more in depth into what zone 1 is and
Would look like.
What it would look like exactly.
So we'll go from zone 0. So right now I'm networking with probably roughly 25 people that are all branching out and purchase land, right? And I want to start again with the homesteaders, because if you launch into a rural area where you're not familiar with the climate zone, you're not familiar with the pestilence, right? Then you really need to have a prefabricated shelter or a trailer, right? A trailer, RV, or prefabricated tiny home. That is the most essential. And so, and you need to have off-grid capability, and it can be affordable, right? I mean, you have groups right now that are prefabricated tiny homes. There's one guy out of Tennessee that is doing them for $20K. You know what I mean? Where they're insulated, have heating and cooling, and have capability for off-grid. So I would say you have to have sustainable shelter that is climate conducive. And in my opinion, it should be prefabricated and also movable, right? If you're going to launch out into rural land, those are the first two things. Then in zone, that's zone 0, off-grid capability, simple, easy to manage shelter that's movable. Zone 0, I would say, is the funnest part to me. Is obviously you have to have water, right? Your water collection, your well or your spraying, in your kitchen garden, in your greenhouse. Okay, so those are the first 2 steps. I would say sustainable shelter, prefabricated shelter, right? Easily movable, deployable, comfortable, off-grid capability. Then you have your water component, which is essential. You either have your well, your spring, your live spring, and your rainwater collection. And then you have your kitchen garden and your greenhouse. You can be very successful with just that.
What would the kitchen garden consist of?
So I have a specific design for kitchen garden. I really encourage people to keep their kitchen garden steps from their front door, meaning that you're.
And why is that?
What's that?
And why is that? For the ease of access and stewardship?
Ease of access, especially in retirement age with disability, you still have a component of stewardship where you see a return for your labor input. You also, when your garden is close to your front door, you have the capability to see, and you'll see something out of place, or you'll see something that needs tending to, right? So you're walking by it, you're consistently seeing it, you're interacting with it, and it becomes part of your lifestyle. I mean, how many times do most people go to the grocery store in a week, right? Even you guys, how often do you have to go now that you're rural? Do you guys?
We try to limit it to once a week.
Yeah. If we can, we don't have refrigeration with winter. Obviously, it makes it a little bit easier. So we eat fresh, but this is kind of one of the reasons we're super excited about talking with you and having you help us with the design, because getting away from the grocery store and having it right out our front door is something that's extremely attractive to me.
Yeah,
so we obviously we have seasons. You have snow right now. So people would say, oh, is that even applicable for 3 or 4 months in the winter season? I would say, well, that's where you have your greenhouse, your complementary greenhouse, or in some geographic climates, even when it's cold, You can have row cover, right, on your beds. Okay, so you start seeing that if you have a strategic design, your garden becomes your grocery store, right? So it's a grocery store garden. So instead of having to go to the grocery store, wait in the long lines, fight over the aisles, you're creating a design that's seasonal, a seasonal grocery store garden, right? And that's what why I'm so intense on studying square foot gardening, biointensive gardening, which is basically a micromanagement of seasonal annual crop close to your front door, high caloric return, right? High calorie return with very little burn. I mean, it's like I'm talking 5 to 10 steps from your back or front door.
So what would be some of the things that we'll be planning in this zone 1 for this caloric return?
So in your kitchen garden, you're gonna, and then again, this is hard to do without the graphics, but you're gonna have your leafy green, right? Your micronutrients, all your leafy greens. Now, those are more micronutrients. Those aren't high calorie crops. When I talk to a lot of, there's a whole prepper movements. There's so many different movements that are kind of going in the same direction right now. They're like, that's what my food eats. I don't need leafy greens. And I can understand what they're saying. I can understand what they're saying as far as calorie, but people, there's also micronutrient we need, right? So, and I know I'm depleted on that right now without having access to it. So leafy greens. In the design, I have sections for food groups, but you also have not only your micronutrient, you have your root crops, right?
Okay.
And your grain crops. So there's strategy of food group that you can put into this design where you're actually meeting holistic nutrient need steps from your front door. So micro
so interesting.
Leafy greens, and it can be strategy. So a lot of times in the permaculture movement, especially with a lot of consultants, they love the food forest design. I love that too. But sometimes a perennial food forest, I would say most of the time, will take many years to come to its fullness, right? So I do believe there's great value in having knowledge in your seasonal and annual crops while also later on building out that food forest. Okay. So what are you going to eat? I know that we could plant in early spring in Missouri, we can plant so strategically that we're seeing food, at least those micronutrients like the leafy greens and stuff, in the first 90 days, right? And then you're starting to look at your root crops of your sweet potato, your russet potatoes, your carrots, your garlic, and your onions, right? And you're looking at higher yield, higher calorie crop, all strategically designed within 20 feet of your front or back door.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah, man, it's awesome. I mean, like I said, I at some point we can freely share this. I'll open source a lot of this information again where people can see.
Yeah, I'm sure everybody, we're getting that the chat is going crazy with people with questions and, just giving feedback on what they think. It's great right now. Can we real quick? I know we're good.
Am I going too off the rock?
No, you're great. We do have a few things. I know you said you want to focus on zone 0 and 1 right now, but is there any way we can give just a quick, just what the different zones would be so people have an understanding of what goes further out?
Okay. And so there's people that are probably already trained in permaculture, and so they have an in-depth understanding from zone 0 to zone 5. But imagine this. So you have your house center. And I don't want to even go specific zones. I actually use colors because I talk to a lot of people that can't grasp the zone idea. I use colors, right? And so, but you're going to have your kitchen garden. This is how I design. I'm going to share how I design it. It's not the only way to design, and there's probably differing opinions in the permaculture community of how to design. But I like to have my kitchen garden in zone 1, my greenhouse, anything of micromanagement, my small scale animal husbandry. And a lot of times there will be an argument with that. Well, we want our animal husbandry farther away. Well, a lot of times in Missouri, if you have your chickens way far away from your front door, those chickens get taken out, right? The ducks get taken out. They all get, by the coyotes, mountain lion, bobcat, whatever it is.
Whatever predators are there.
So and that's why I wish we could just show. Do you have any of the pictures that you could show, brother, right now of the color design? Because that would give people a better understanding.
Yeah, we'll still have to pull them up. In the meantime, can you give us a little brief understanding about how you plant zone 1? Do you just dig up the ground? Do you do raised beds?
No, I do a specific method for the kitchen garden. I've studied multiple different methods, but for that zone 1 kitchen garden, I use a raised bed methodology called square foot gardening. I even use soil amendment. So I use an input. To me, that's the most valuable thing for me to do. Is I'm okay with bringing input into my kitchen garden if I can't access it on the land, because even to compost on the land, there's time, right? A timetable to have to compost. So I really just focus in on a square foot gardening method, raised beds. Usually the beds are at least 6 to 12 inches tall, and there's a specific mix within the bed.
Okay.
It makes it
And
very
is there a reason that you prefer raised beds over, say, putting in the ground? What is the reasoning behind that? I know you said square foot gardening, but what is the benefits to
Okay,
the?
so for example, when I launched out to Missouri with this prefabricated homestead kit, it was basically a kit. So I knew even before I got to the property what I was going to build out there. And it didn't matter even the contour of the land, I could use the contour of the land and use my design. When I got out there, a lot of the neighbors, rural neighbors, came out to see what I was doing. And I had my prefabricated 12 raised beds with 4 seasonal sections, right? A bed basically per month, right?
Okay.
Of the year. And it's really strategic. It's hard to describe in words. It's probably confusing, but I had my raised beds. I had my soil mix that I already connected with the local nursery in the area within 30 miles from the homestead. I brought that mix in, which was fortified blend compost, peat moss, and vermiculite. I brought that mix in, and the guys come out and they're like, "Why aren't you just tilling?" You know, all my neighbors are like, "Why aren't you just tilling?" I said, "Well, the rain out here, man, I'm really worried about losing all my crop." You know what I mean? And they're like, "Well, you're right. We lost all our crop last year. At least our early spring and spring crop just got destroyed from the rains." You know. Sure enough, right after I installed, I planted, I sowed seed and also had starts, and we got 24 inches of rain in like 2 days in the county. And then within the week, there was mass flooding everywhere. Now, my plants survived. Why was that? Because the soil that I had was strategic in the sense of that it could drain well, right? It wasn't tilled. It wasn't hard packed clay. And that's one of the main reasons right there is proper drainage, proper moisture retention, right? So when you have peat moss, and you have these coarse vermiculite in your mix, you're basically creating a potting soil that can retain moisture and drain excess moisture, right? While also holding nutrients. So that's one of the main reasons for square foot gardening is if you have heavy rain or if you have drought, you have the mix will hold the moisture for you. To me, that's the most worthy investment right there in your kitchen garden, because again, this is a garden that you want to lay the right foundation. Just like you're building a house, you don't want to build a house on a faulty foundation. So that's one reason. The second reason is I don't plant conventionally like in rows. So you'll see a lot of methods that they'll till up an area and they plant one seed in a row, depending if 6 inches, 12 inches, right? Square foot gardening is a whole different planting method that is high intensity planting per square foot. So you can plant 4 head of lettuce in 1 square foot, right? So that's a lot different than most planting methods. And I have pictures to show this where it's not just theory. But that's another reason is you get high yield and less use space, right? Less weeding because you're not tilling grass in, so you're not having to compete with the grass. You have very few, if any, weed seed because you're using mostly compost, right? And the weed seed is gone, and so it's just way easier to manage. And that can be shown through a picture.
One thing for everyone that's watching, I will upload the link to the files here after the live stream. I'm having trouble getting it on on the back end here where we're attempting to. If I can get it up here, I will. If not, there will be a link in the description after the live stream that you can kind of view what he's talking about. We did have one question from someone, and we kind of started on it about, can you roughly name zone 0 to 5 real quick? So shelter is 0, water is 1, and the kitchen garden.
Well, all your micromanagement, because I don't want to go in advance of it. All your micromanagement close to the house. So your 0 and 1 is your shelter, your micromanaged kitchen garden, and anything that you need access to, daily access. I would say your well, whatever you guys have, your rainwater collection system. And then when you transition to that, this is where you'll start seeing a lot of different theories, right? So that's why I use colors, because some guys will say, from your zone 2 and 3, you're looking at larger pasture, right? Prairie. If you're having large scale animal husbandry, like cattle or sheep, are goat. Does that make sense? Then
Mhm.
those are gonna be in your ladder zones. And then so from anywhere from, you'll see different opinions in this. So anywhere from 2 to zone 4, you're gonna have a lot of different opinions from large scale animal husbandry, large scale grain crops, right? So if a lot of people want to grow grain, so in the ladder zones of their homestead design on outer perimeter, and that could be different opinion between zone 2 to 4, you're seeing guys put in large paddocks of corn, soy, wheat. Zone 5 is basically the woodlands, right? The woodlands and the forest. So I have a different opinion on this. That's why I can't really share my strategic zones as far as what I implement, because we don't have the schematic or the blueprint. But I encourage people to study for themselves, take what they like, leave what they don't, because there's a lot of theory out there without actual models, right? So there are
Mhm.
guys, when we would go and build these designs, have them a working model, you'd have somebody that's been an expert and studied the permaculture manual by Mollison, and they would critique and say, well, why don't you have this zone, or what is this zone, right? And I'd say, man, that's subject to interpretation and application. And so that's why my hope is, even in this dialogue, is to say 0 to 1 priority. Your other zones are going to be your larger scale stewardship, where large grain crops, pasture, large scale animal husbandry, in forest, right? The forest. So I don't know if that makes sense. I wish I could just show you the
So
picture.
when you say large scale, but these are all things that people can do on a smaller scale homestead, correct? If someone only
Yeah,
has
yeah,
2 or 3 acres, they can implement these same designs that you have without it being large scale operations.
yeah. It's really, like I said, it's hard for me to explain without the picture. But basically, what I can explain how my zones work is, I have a kitchen garden, I have a greenhouse right next to the front door, very close to a well or water resource, right?
Hmm.
Rainwater collection system. Then I have small scale areas of grazing and pasture for animal husbandry. Okay. So that's
Okay.
where my chicken coop is, where I can micromanage my chicken and duck. Okay. Because
Okay.
if I want to save those animals, I want them close to me, but I don't want them a nuisance, right? I don't want them perching on my front porch. So it's all strategy. Okay.
Right.
So it goes from my kitchen garden to my small scale pasture area. I like to move my chicken house around. I don't like it sedentary. Then from there, I have my root crop section, which is also a raised bed methodology. From the root crop sections, right, I have my dwarf fruit tree orchard and medicinals.
Okay.
And then from the dwarf fruit tree orchard and medicinals, I have a complementary compost section. So that's basically micromanagement. And if someone looked at the design, they would actually consider that all in zone 1 and 2, because there's micromanagement there. Does that make sense?
Right.
So
Yeah.
0 the home, and then all that is in zone, 1, and mostly zone 1. That's why I'm really cautious in sharing a bigger picture, because you can have that holistic design all crammed in within steps of your door, front door.
Right.
So I mean, and there's going to be people that have probably learned these methods and have different opinions. Are they asking if there's people on here that have studied the zone designs?
But we have one of the viewers, Donnie
Yeah,
Carter, saying,
yeah,
everyone has a different way of doing this, but
yeah.
in all, you design your homestead to suit your best needs.
Okay, so I think a better way. It's kind of hard to do this, just sharing openly quickly. I would say
Right.
this: the goal is to design in such a way where you're meeting holistic calorie needs with redundancy in design. Does that make
Okay.
sense? So having backups to backups in design. So
Could you actually explain that a little bit more in depth, what you mean by
okay.
that?
So my kitchen garden close to my front door, right? With my seasonal and annual food that I have to micromanage because I have to sow, that is going to be complemented by a perennial hugel bed garden on further out in design. Does that make
Okay.
sense?
Yeah.
So I have, and this can only be shown. I wish I could show you guys with pictures, but I have my seasonal annuals close to the front door that need more labor input, but I get a higher return. Further from the front door, I have perennial food crops designed in hugel bed where need less input, and I plant them once or twice, right?
Right.
And I let them grow strategically. And I have pictures of all this. But yeah, that's basically what you're doing. And so the root crops that are closer to my front door are going to be complemented further away from the front door with grain crop. Does that make sense? So paddocks
Okay.
of corn, wheat, soy, even monocropping on the outer perimeter is going to complement those root crop sections. So you're basically building redundancies in your design so you have backups to backups.
I like it. It almost sounds like. So my question is, and you kind of mentioned like that, you know, some people might be opposed to some of the ideas and the way you planned your zoning, but to me, when listening to it, it sounds like it should just be the way. I mean, it sounds practical.
Well, I think there's a lot of people, like, you can go to someone's house that's never heard of permaculture before, and just pain is their teacher, and you can see how with age design gets closer and closer to the house, right?
Right.
So most of the calls that I get, I've never advertised really. I would just do a project, someone would see it, and then I would get a call, and it usually the call is from somebody over 50 or 60 years old usually. And whether they've lost a spouse or they no longer have a partner to assist them, they want to downsize. And it's interesting how by pain and suffering, their blueprint almost resembles what I'm trying to articulate without pictures, which is difficult for me. I mean, I'm not the sharpest tool in the shed in articulation, and you can see that a lot of people start to entertain the idea of square foot gardening, small greenhouse, right? Raised bed garden, square foot, small greenhouse, close to the front door, keeping the animal husbandry closer to the front door, right? So the garden's no longer 200, 300 yards away in a tilled up section on outer perimeter. It's all getting closer and closer, right? And so I think that's the most important thing about design is that we're thinking long-term as our built-in retirement plan, as our daily or weekly grocery store, and how should that cater to our needs and the needs of our family. So did I answer that all right, buddy? Or?
Yeah, it does. And to me, what it just speaks is that you're taking with the strategic zone planning, you're taking a smaller amount of land and getting the most yield out of the least amount of energy output.
Yeah, so it's kind of, if you look at small to big, your ladder zones, your 5 and your 4 zones are the less managed woodlands. If not, 5 is no management. It's just your woodlands, right? You guys have excess woodlands on your property.
Correct.
And you want to leave that as much as possible. And then it's going to transition into your larger design, which needs less input of energy. So from your grain crops, if you're going to do large scale grain crops, right? From your larger scale animal husbandry, meaning your cattle, your sheep, your goat,
chickens.
Yeah. And if you're doing large scale chicken stewardship, where some people want, 300, 400 chickens, you know what I mean? So you're going to need a larger area, and you're not going to want 300, 400 chickens close to your front door. And then you're going to transition into your smaller scale, your micromanaged dwarf fruit tree, medicinals, berries, orchard, composting section, your raised bed gardens for your root crop. And then obviously if you want smaller scale husbandry close to your front door, and your raised garden bed, your kitchen bed. So it's really that simple, and it has to be shown, I feel like, in a picture, because you can see that closer to the house, high calorie, more labor input, further from the house, less calorie return possibility, right? But less management responsibility.
So it kind of equalizes out.
And we have a lot of urban farmers here too. So what would you recommend on starting a small scale garden for people in urban areas that don't necessarily have a yard, but might have a patio? Or
that's where square foot gardening, I love it. That's most of what we did in the very beginning. Is I connected with recycling yards, Craigslist, people on Craigslist that were looking to get rid of wood scraps, even buckets and things of that nature. You can source a lot of materials for free if you know where to look. And bucket gardening, one raised bed with the right soil can yield a lot of, we had prototypes where just one 4x4 bed done with the square foot garden method was producing 20 pounds of food annually.
Wow.
And that's pretty cool. So you get 2 crops usually out of that. And I have all those pictures that I'll open source, but I would encourage that those that are in the urban environment that can't get out, I don't want to discourage you, because currently even I'm in an urban environment, right? To learn the methodology, small scale, you can have great success, right? In a 15 by 15, we grew thousands of pounds of food, my first garden. Many of the gardens I did were all in the urban core. So it's all about square foot gardening. I would encourage you to study square foot gardening methodology, raised bed gardening, and how to create soil mix, your right soil mix. Because if you start out, if the seed falls on the good soil, you're going to have a return. So even if it's in a food grade bucket, I had sisters, I call them sisters, women, close friends, where we did this 3 4x4 gardens in their backyard, right? In the urban core. And just a lot of success because we knew what we were doing with what we put in the mix, right?
So what you're saying is like this whole plan of the zone planning isn't, and I believe we talked about this yesterday. It's not a linear thing, and it can be kind of.
It's more organic. It's very organic.
Yeah.
Like you'll see if you pull up zone planning right now, you're going to get a lot of different opinions. If you source to the Bill Mollison book, it can be Shakespearean. Like it almost sounds like the Old Testament Bible in the language. So, but you'll see that it's organic and the zones kind of ebb and flow. And that's why I'm really cautious because even a disclaimer, if I share one certain way, even if it's straight from the book, it becomes almost a doctrine of some people, right? And so my whole thing is I want to see people have success close to the front door. And I think that starts with the kitchen garden. And if you're in the urban core, if your kitchen garden is only 1 4x4 bed, right? Or 1 bucket with 6 to 12 inches of the right mix in there that's going to create a return, then that's where you start. It's not going to always be obviously a linear design. I like linear at times because it's easy to manage, right? Mm-hmm. And it's also easy to collect the data off of it. But you're absolutely right. It can be totally organic. It's more of ebb and flow of design. And you can go right now and look on Google and you'll see all these people that have presented their zone plans, right? And there's different opinions.
Okay. And none of them are either right or wrong. It's all based upon your land itself or what your needs might be.
Yeah, I went to Jeff Lawton's school. It was the first one that was opened online. And even in that class, there was this conflict of methodology. Like the first guys are like, we cannot do raised bed. We can't bring any input in. We can't bring soil in, right? But then they would purchase a big tractor, right? And they would clear land. So it's like, wait, you said we can't have any input. It becomes a religion. That's why I'm really guarding what I'm saying. I think that it's up to the individual, but at least we're sowing seeds of, hey, consider a zone plan. My encouragement is in the zone plan, really focus on that sustainable shelter if you're actually going rural that can keep you comfortable and simple and minimalism while you build out your kitchen garden. Because a successful kitchen garden, you'll see a lot of these guys now, there's a lot of people are going back to raised bed gardens because they're realizing that you can get so much yield when you do it with wisdom. And not only yield, you're going to create biomass in excess of materials from what you grow that you can compost and replenish. So it becomes closed loop. And I have many friends that weren't a fan of raised bed gardening at all. They're big into the forest. But when they went out rural, they realized they couldn't hunt and gather for most of their calorie needs, especially with the pest pressures, the ticks and the chiggers in Missouri. And so they all started to go back towards looking at the raised bed or the kitchen garden as their priority to meet most of their calories, right? So again, just to answer your question on what can people in the urban core do? A lot. I mean, that's where we started, and we had complete mini farms on 1/4 of an acre with everything that I'm talking about. Does that make sense?
That is awesome.
I mean, I have all the pictures, buddy. Inspiring. I mean, the hard drive's getting worked on right now, but you can have everything in 1/4 of an acre. Shoot, you could cram almost every, in my opinion, with strategy. And this is where I don't want to create a fence, but you can cram your dwarf fruit trees. You can create a food forest with all your micromanagement in a very small space. You could literally have every zone.
Okay, that's very good to know.
Really? That is good to know. Because the way when you were talking about this, it almost seemed like, you said 1/4 acre, but with how you said the zones, it almost seems like you would need more land for all of those different zones to be in there.
Well, this is where the argument comes, right? And this is where I really struggled in the permaculture courses and classes, is most of them really appreciate woodlands, right? But that's not applicable for most people. They don't have a zone 5 that's established forest, right? Most of them are confined to a city or within 30 miles from a city, and they don't have an established forest. So we started out with the raised bed kitchen garden, and then we could show in just 4,000 square feet, 2,000 square feet, even less. You can have those layers of design, right? Those zone design in a very small space. But it just gets complicated. So there's so many different opinions. And then there's also generations that learn certain methods that any method that's not of what they learned, right, is not what was passed down to them. There's kind of an offense, and I just don't believe there's even time for that. Hey, whatever you're doing to grow your own food, as long as it's not exploitive, right, and it's working for you, go for it. Now, I would
Right.
say that we should have strategy and design where we're no longer going to be heavy dependent on large earth moving equipment, that we don't have to have heavy labor input, especially if we're getting older and we're prone to injury or we have some form of disability, that our focus should be really close to the front house, to the front door, I mean.
And what is your recommendation for those urban people that have rules where they can't have a small pond that produces the protein, or they can't have chickens that produces a protein?
The eggs or whatever. Yeah.
Okay, so
Like,
that happened to us a lot. We actually changed some of the laws in Kansas City, the group I was with, to have chickens and stuff. But even if you change the law, if you still have population density where everybody's crammed, and there's grace to have chickens, but you can have a big mess with chickens in a small space, right? You can have
Right.
accumulation. So my encouragement to people is to really focus on their raised bed garden or their bucket gardens. Do that which you see a return from, that you get enjoyment from, that you don't have to have heavy financial investment in, right? And you don't have to have heavy labor input. So I would stay away from husbandry, any form of, and I mean by animal stewardship. I would stay away from that in the urban environments right now. I really would, especially with the disease and pandemic and stuff. I really focus on more of your vegetable crop and your vegan calories.
Okay.
Yeah, I really don't encourage animal husbandry in the urban core. We did that. We brought in Nigerian dwarf goats, chickens, ducks. Goats are escape artists, so we had a lot of.
Yes, they are.
So I mean, we had goats running through the inner urban core, and then I had, you can get fines and you have all these issues. And so my encouragement is if you find yourself in a city, this is your awesome opportunity to study, right? Study these methodologies. I'm going to open source information, hopefully on your community, chat, where people can access these books in this information, where they can really zone in on their study. Have a little garden. Maybe it's one bed, maybe it's one bucket. Steward it with wisdom and see the return from it. And then that's going to equip you while you draw out your plan, and it'll keep your heart alive. You can literally be in your apartment, maybe you have a south facing a patio, and you can grow one tomato plant in a bucket while you're drawing out your greater plan. Like maybe it's a half an acre plan, your dream, you know what I mean? And whatever it is, this is your opportunity to study if you're in the city. I would not invest in, trying to raise chickens, in a backyard that's really small, less than 500 square feet or something. I want to do it, but just really focus in on studying. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
It.
I was going to say a lot of the people watching right now that I'm looking have homestead. Some of them are in the urban, but a lot of them I do know have their own parcels of land, and most of them have experience in gardening. And I know this is I think, like a bully was saying, he was really interested in potentially looking into the square foot gardening. So I was kind of hoping.
Yeah, because he's in Missouri.
He's in Missouri too.
He knows the flooding.
Yeah. So
Missouri. I think that I hope I didn't go off on too many tangents. This is kind of usually when I share, I have a real specific, but this is kind of free flow, which is good. But Is there anything else I could answer more specifically?
But this is and for everyone listening, this is a philosophy that we are going to be adopting on our homestead, and we're going to be working with Santi here and how to design out and implement on Soul-Fed Homestead. So this is one of the reasons I'm really excited and wanted everyone to hear from him and what his philosophies were.
Yeah, I think mine has always been aim small, miss small, close to the front door. I've served most of the people I serve. This is out of my element. It's usually one-on-one, and it's usually people that are disabled or gone through some kind of loss. And this is kind of my avocation. It's not my career. I don't get paid for any of this. And so that's opened up a lot of opportunity and a lot of projects because there's not a heavy financial investment. So I've networked with many, and I can confidently say that I really encourage people to focus in small stewardship, close to the front or back door, especially if you're getting older. And again, that's why I think that kitchen garden, square foot garden, raised bed gardening, close to the front or back door, you can have great success, and you can design in such a way where you have all the components of even what a lot of the permaculturists will say, permaculture designers will say is an abundant food forest. Well, you can make that small too with your dwarf, your dwarf and semi-dwarf fruit trees. Just in a very small space, you can have all those components in zone design. That's why I'm really cautious in sharing specifics of zone design, because somebody that doesn't have large acreage, they think, oh, I have to have large acreage to have all this, right? I think you can grow the majority of your caloric needs, like I said, in less than half an acre. Right. And I've seen it.
I agree.
So I know that there's guys doing it on way less than that, more like a fourth of an acre. But these guys are not popular. They're not very popular on the media. They're too busy doing it.
Right, of course.
Of course. So, and why do you think that? Do you think that? Why do you think that there's such a division in the different philosophies on how to grow?
Well, just yesterday, man, the day before yesterday, while I'm feeling kind of sick, is this is a perfect example. I get called. This is a free service, right? So a guy calls me out to his land. He has 8 to 10 acres. I go out there. He's getting older, right? There's a lot of equipment on the land that no longer can be maintained or managed. He's widowed. And so circumstantially, the land that was once a blessing is now becoming a burden, right?
Right.
So there's stuff on the land that's a burden. For a man at times, if he sees a big piece of equipment and can no longer till with it, or that equipment's broken down, that can become a burden because he's looking at something that he no longer has the physical capability to use, right? Or the financial resource to use. And so it brings a lot of sadness, right? So I get out there and immediately I begin to share, hey, why don't we scale this back, sir? And I'll come out here and I'll serve you. We can design it together. Let's start with a raised bed garden. You have this beautiful land. You have a well. You have a home that has the fireplace. You have rainwater collection. You have a lot of the amazing pieces to make yourself comfortable. Now let's help you grow food where you don't need the big tractor that you're struggling with, right? It's like almost every project I get called to, the big equipment's broken or it's breaking down. And then simultaneously, as the bigger equipment's breaking down, the body's breaking down. So we get out there and he has a buddy over and I start sharing square foot gardening, showing the pictures. He's hyped, but it's so countercultural, right? Because they grew up with the big machine, the tiller behind the big machine, right? Now, even though circumstantially those tools and even those skill sets are no longer applicable, right? That's all they know. So it's almost like sharing information. This is why I open source and share freely. I always, when I go out, it's one-on-one with pictures and videos, and I serve, but there's usually some form of offense, right?
Because you're going against everything that they've learned and been doing for years.
And I feel why I got sick is I'm helping him create compost because he wants to see the composting methodology. A lot of people have never learned about compost. They've learned to till and fertilize and then use synthetic interventions, right, to kill the pests. Okay.
Right.
So I usually, when I do the kitchen garden, we're talking about compost. And if they don't have the financial means, right, to pay for compost, a lot of them don't want to, right? Then it's say, let's make it. So I had already helped him for the last 2 weeks on and off collect leaves. And so we're taking the leaves and we're creating layers of compost, right, in our compost bin. But I'm having a lot of exposure because there's heavy pesticide spray on that land of Roundup, right? And so you start seeing that there's been a lot of management that would be different than mine on land that can be detrimental to doing these countercultural methods. So if someone's spraying Roundup, right, and they spray pesticides all over and weed killer all over the land, and the trees have saturated that, the grass clippings that we're collecting have saturated that can cause an issue, right, in how we micromanage if we're going to do raised beds, if we're using those materials. I have gone out on projects where people have wanted to get away from those practices of large scale management of tilling, 2 to 3 acres, planting the garden, and then use pesticides and weed killers. They want to get away from that, but there's been a consequence of those methods on the land. So here I am coming to this guy's land. He's in a time of transition in life. He sees that he can no longer steward larger acreage. He sees that he no longer has the capability to even manage the big equipment, and all the equipment's breaking down. And here I am offering to assist, but yet it's against everything he knows and he's been taught. So to love him well, I'm still going to share and serve, but he may not necessarily be receptive, even though he's asking me for the help. Does that make sense? So it's
Yeah.
just, this is why I volunteer, man. I volunteer in it because I know that there's more to it than just sharing a garden method. It's literally a transition of season of life, and we should honor our elders. But everything now, circumstantially, is confirming the legitimacy to what I'm trying to share, even though I'm a flawed messenger, right? I know, because he's like,
As
Santi,
we
I'm
all
seeing
are.
the grocery stores, right? The shelves are empty. He's like, and then if the shelves are empty, how am I going to have access to the fuel for my tractor, right? At some point, what if I don't have access to the fuel to my tractor? What if I no longer have access to the parts to fix my tractor, right?
Right.
Those are all the questions that I asked, right, in the very beginning. But I was taught from a quadriplegic man that was cloaked in humility. He had no physical capability, but he had a brilliant mind. And everything he taught me was steps from the front door. And it was so countercultural. I mean, man, I've been invited to church groups where, again, I don't go out looking for any of this. They see a prototype garden and then they'll say, "Who did that?" and word of mouth. I got invited to a church group one time. I get out there to the urban core and I brought all the materials. I had a recycling yard where I had all the material access with no cost for the church group. And they were in the urban core. And so I had prefabricated beds. I brought out like 10 prefabricated beds, laid them down, had the compost connected with the local nursery. So it was no cost to them. But as soon as I started to teach and install the garden beds, there was great offense with the head religious shepherd, the pastor, because he brought out a tiller. So even though I was invited, there's a conflict of cultural, and I have to honor that man's culture. I have to honor his conditioning and his training. I don't want to condemn it because he's still growing food, right? But I think that circumstantially, in the current crisis that we're facing, socioeconomic crisis, gradually more and more men, even that have been trained in other methodology, conventional methodology of agricultural management, are going to yield and be cloaked in humility and start adopting some of these ideas. Does that make sense?
Yes, makes perfect sense. You want to open this up to some questions?
Yeah.
You okay with answering some questions from some of the viewers?
Okay,
I know this kind of probably been all over the place in bunny trail.
No, that was great.
It was excellent, Santi. Okay, the first question that we have comes from two people actually, and they're wondering how you cycle your plants to amend the soil in your raised beds, or if you do so.
I do that, and so okay. Again, I really encourage people to. There's so many different opinions on this, right? And especially if you go on the internet. Have you ever been sick, real quick, on a bunny trail, and you go on Google, and then it's like you find out that you think you have like 20 different diseases, and they all so that's
always me.
Okay, so that's why I encourage people to start with the Square Foot Gardening book. I don't get paid to say that. It's just so simple that it shows you. So it shows you all the basics: how to plant, what to plant in, seasonal planting, companionship planting. So it breaks it down. So I think just any basic book like Square Foot Gardening book will give you that understanding where you're not overwhelmed by information online and all the different teachers. But yes, so I have seasonal sections in my garden. These guys know I have 4 sections. So I have 4 sections, and each section there's a strategy of the seasonal crop that would go in that section. And so I would plant my early spring and spring crop. And then once that crop is at a time for harvest, I have the harvest, and then I have all the excess, right? So I take that excess and I compost it. Okay. Now, what I'll do is that will become that land becomes bare. I don't even use all the big terminology, but you have ground that is no longer has anything in it in that seasonal section. Well, I also will replenish the compost, and I can grow another crop in that section.
Right.
For the beginner, does that make sense? Am I answering the question?
Does that deplete the soil? Do you have to add anything to the soil eventually?
Yeah, so Square Foot Gardening, I've adopted Square Foot Gardening principle, but I compost, and I try to replenish the soil annually at least 2 to 6 inches. Now, if I'm going to re-sow into those garden beds, I like to add 2 to 4 inches. Does that make sense?
Very good.
So I don't want to, because this is where it gets real complicated, right? Like a skilled square foot gardener or biointensive market gardener can plant out a bed right after one harvest. They're amending the soil, fertilizing the soil, like amending it with compost, fertilizer, and then they're replanting. But for somebody in a beginner, they may not necessarily have the skill set yet. So it's okay if that ground rests, right, without resowing it. And I do that too. So I don't know, but yes, you can replant if you're going to replant. My encouragement is to add compost to that in some form of on-site tea, compost tea. That's what. But I could show you all that on our prototypes.
Okay, next question. Thank you so much. I think that answered that for
Yep.
them.
But the goal, really quick, I want to add on that is
Sure.
compost. If you have a strategy of design, so you already have your kitchen garden and you already have your compost bins ready, you're going to take whatever excess is off the harvest, the biomass material, and you're already going to know how to create that good compost and what ingredients are in that compost. And that is going to be your replenishment for those beds. And I think that can happen easily within the first 1 to 3 years, where you're no longer dependent on inputs, right? You don't have to purchase compost. You don't have to even purchase seed if your blueprint is correct, right? Where you're creating a closed loop design. So yes, you do want to fertilize, but you want to make it where you're not having to go store buy it. You're actually composting on site. And then with that, you're strategically planting in sections where you're not growing the same seasonal annuals in the same spot every year. And that's for disease and pest preventions.
That actually kind of follows up to the next question.
Yeah.
What is the from Apple Tree Urban Homestead best way to start a compost pile that is effective? They want to know.
This is funny because I've trained multiple different composting styles. I like however, I like 4x4 or 5x5 compost bins. And depending on your geographic region, if you're going to want to hold moisture in, right? Mm-hmm. Or if you have a place like Missouri, you could have, or Tennessee, you could have heavy rain where you're going to have to cover your compost. These are different things that you're going to have to study personally on how to manage your compost. My personal opinion is we use a simple 4x4. We use a 3x3, 4x4, or 5x5 bin. And you can look online. You can see many different models. Again, depending on your geographic climate zone, you're going to want aeration. You're possibly going to even need to cover your compost, right? So this is something like the Square Foot Gardening book will teach you that. It will teach you how to compost. And you just need basic foundational understanding. And then we layer that with carbon and nitrogen materials. And in your design, you actually have the capability to produce all the materials, which most people would consider waste, which is not waste. It's the biomass that you're actually going to put in your bins and that can be replenished, right? So I like 3x3s, 4x4s, or 5x5 bins. They can be a 3-sided bin that looks like a U, again, depending on your geographic climate zone. And also you can contain it with, I have pictures, buddy. I'm going to have to just show you, you know what I mean?
I'll share.
We're going to put all of this stuff up for everyone to be able to access.
The funny thing on that is I did the 3x3 bins and had profound success. I actually have it documented how much compost I was able to produce off just one design with just 3 beds in a compost bin. And it's amazing. I show it in picture, and then I go and train under a biointensive farmer, and he doesn't have them in bins at all. He has one T-post in the ground that's 4 feet high, and he spreads the material around the T-post, right? And he builds it up to 5 feet high and 5 feet wide, right? And he was adamant, this is the only way you compost, buddy. And it was a slow compost. And then I go to another teacher, right? I was like, he does a Berkeley method where it's fast compost using a lot of turning, right? So he creates a heap, and he had a strategy where he would move the heap into, there's 3 bins, and he would layer all his diverse carbon and nitrogen, and then we would take a fork and move it every single day. And within 18 days, it's breaking down. But he was adamant about that was the only way to do compost, right?
Okay.
So I never want to discourage. I want to encourage people to study the basic foundations of what is compost, how do we make it. But it could be as simple as just a little 4x4, 4 foot high, 4 foot wide U, where you're stacking your organic materials in there, your biomass from what you grow. That's what we do. I mean, we keep it so remedial level that yeah.
So, someone asked if they should add worms to it.
Okay, so in the Ozarks, the interesting thing, when I went out there, a lot of people thought that I wouldn't be able to grow anything because it was all rock. like you go an inch down and you have nothing but Ozark rock, right? Well,
Right.
that's why I loved raised bed gardening. And there was no worms on site at all where I was. And I was in like, it was, 80% woodlands. It was just like roughly one of these sites is 20 acres. And I only had a 2-acre parcel that I was micromanaging, but it was only specifically like 1,000 square feet. By the time I put my organic matter there, I had worms showing up within a couple months. So,
Wow.
so yes, you can add worms. Like in the urban environment, we had a we grew our own worms. We had worm casting. We fed our own worms vegetable scraps because the castings obviously are a fertilizer. So the answer to that is yes, you can add worms. Just depends on if you need to.
Right. Because it sounds like they're going to come in naturally anyway, most likely.
Man, but that's why I say it's amazing nature when you begin to mimic nature, the natural process, what comes. We had no birds or anything. By the time we were within my second year of stewardship on most prototypes, between 1 and 2 years, if you're designing right, you're bringing pollinators in. You're bringing butterflies, birds, bees. You have the right food for the worms. They come too. You know what I mean? So
Very
yes,
cool.
I would say, yeah, that's where it's like not a yes or no specifically. It's not black or white. It's just
This is going to kind of go off a little bit, just
Yeah.
with what you said about bringing in the pollinators, and it's something we discussed the other day. You were talking about, and it's kind of again going off on something that different than what we discussed. But in zone 5, with the way you planted, you said you were seeing people who had to hunt, and they're getting strapped up and got like their tech gear or their tack gear on, and they're going ready to hunt, and you have. In the way you've designed where it brings them in to you.
I mean, like a pond, for example, water, right? Water in the time of heat or water even in the time of cold. I used to come out and I'd have armadillo I had a micro pond install and I would have armadillo that would come out in the winter trying to look for water. And I would, and if the little micro pond was frozen over, we're talking about a little small pond, I'd break the ice and the armadillo was so thirsty, I wouldn't even scare it off. You see what I mean?
Right.
I'd have deer come in. And so again, that's why I like these design implementations. You can have so much calorie return and so much aesthetic beauty within feet of your front door with strategy of design. And so, yes, yeah, you build it. If you build it, they will come. Meaning, show up. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Yes, that's a perfect way of saying it.
If you build it, they'll come.
All right, let's see. What else do we have? Do we have any other questions here? So what books would you recommend? Someone did ask. I know you just mentioned one, but let's give it.
I would really encourage for someone just getting into this is Square Foot Gardening.
Who's that by?
Gardening, at least like the second or third generation of the book. I don't know about the newest generation. I'm actually a teacher, a certified teacher, but I haven't pursued any of that. And I really like the second and third generation of the book. That was before Mel passed away.
And who's the author of this?
What's that?
Who is the author of this book?
Mel Bartholomew. All new.
So Square Gardening by Mel Bartholomew.
Yeah, and then another book is How to Grow More Vegetables by Sean Jes. Now, those guys are both. Sean Jes has a little bit of a different methodology, but it's very similar understandings of, micromanagement and biointensive, meaning it's high yield. It's what all the market gardeners use is a variation of those methods. Now, some of those guys, they don't even know those teachers. They just adopt things that make sense. But those are the two books, How to Grow More Vegetables by Sean Jes and All New Square Foot Gardening, at least the second or third generation of the book by Mel Bartholomew. And I really believe that's a great place to start, because if you have an understanding on the basics of raised bed gardening, composting, and 6 inches to 12 inches of the right mix in your raised bed, you're going to have profound success, whether you're, a beginner or not. Like I said, like a lot of people will get upset with square foot gardening because if people follow the principles, they usually have master gardener success as far as growth, right? And it's offensive to a lot of master gardeners that may have used other methodologies. And Mel talks about that. I've had long dialogues with him, prior to his death via email, where he would talk about where he would try to present the methods, but people are used to it their way. And even though if it was successful, it still caused offense.
So that doesn't make sense to me. Like you said
Yeah.
before, if you're growing food, what does it matter what technique you're using? This just seems like what you're saying with the zone planning just seems like a plan for the future for maximizing your yield with less energy so that you could steward, as you say, your garden for the long term.
You can see why I'm really guarded in talking about the 5 zones, because a lot of people are either confined to the city without the experiential knowledge yet, or they're moving out on larger land and they get overwhelmed by all the possibilities on big land. And I've seen that over and over where, in the Ozarks, a lot of people moved out there and you see properties selling over, 3 or 4 times because they had these big ideas, right? Big project ideas. They got overwhelmed by the project and then they couldn't even do the labor. I'm confident that you invest time and energy, whether you're in the urban core on a kitchen garden, right? If you invest time and energy of study and you build it out, however small or big it is, you're going to have great return from it. I really believe it.
I believe that too.
And that's why,
yeah.
I hope I didn't frustrate people. Who are like, what are the specific zones? I was like, well, when you have the big picture, but yet you don't have the understanding of the small, the big becomes overwhelming, right? And then you're like, oh, I'm going to have a forest garden. I'm going to grow my own trees for my own house. And I've seen this, right? And it's like, man, you don't even have a kitchen garden yet,
Yeah. So it's one of the questions I do have now. Does the zone gardening, is it, what is the word I'm looking for? Are you supposed to start with 0, then you go with 1? Is 2 the next one you're going to do? I mean, is it laid out that way? Or could you?
I don't, like I said, I wish I could show, I teach in a color, like an organic color, like spheres, right? Because I saw with the zone, people get fixated on the zone design.
Yeah.
So I'm going to be cautious in how I even speak into that. I really am, because there's permaculture design guys that are fixated on those specific zones. My heart is caloric, calorie return, right? Close to the front door. And to me, it's instead of zones, it's like spheres, right? It's organic spheres, but they're so differing depending on who's teaching you. And I think we're going to have to show it in picture, buddy. You know what I mean? Okay. I think it really has to be shown in picture.
All right. Let's see. We have any other questions here? Did I miss one, actually, I believe?
I think Glenn asked something about how your thoughts on cardboard composting or the cardboard method.
So this is where when I share the pictures, we've done everything from tilling back to eating garden method. So the concern that I had, we use cardboard to mulch out a lot of times. Is that what he's asking, where you use the cardboard as basically like a weed barrier? You place that and then you build on top of the cardboard your organic matter, almost like a lasagna garden. Is that what he's asking?
That's what I would imagine that he's asking, because that's my familiar with it.
That was my understanding of what it was.
So when we did a lot of installs in the urban core, cardboard was readily available, right? And so what guys would do is they watch a lot of YouTube videos, which is good, and then they would put the cardboard down, and then they would do, the lasagna method with organic matter, and then they would put like 2 to 4 inches of compost on top of that without borders. Well, the grass was it didn't mulch out the grass, and so the grass would grow through, and then the grass would overwhelm. Okay. Does that make sense? So I'm not a big fan, unless you're going to be managing it and adding organic matter on top. I'm not a big fan of cardboard on top of grass. I'd rather cut the grass out, right, to expose the virgin dirt. And then if I was going to use cardboard, I place the cardboard on top. My concern is always, if you're going to do that on grass, you're going to have grass encroachment. That's again why I love the raised bed method, and the way that I do it. We're trying to prevent the grass from overtaking your food.
Have you? What I was going to say, when you have the raised garden, when you use raised garden beds, do you ever have a problem with moles or voles coming up into them, or how do you prevent that?
I personally, I've been in, again, the Ozarks, we didn't have a lot of that issue. There's so much rocks. And the inner city gardens, I think I've done over 100 installs in the urban environments of backyards. I never had those issues with my 6 inches of soil. I'm not saying that that's not the case, though. You could probably find somebody that has had their carrots stolen from underneath. But methodologies that some of the guys would use that I never have had to is they would lay chicken wire or some form of barrier that allows for drainage, but would prevent the rodent from coming up. Does that make sense?
So like small crushed rock would work.
I use, I mean, maybe, crushed rock, some kind of weed barrier. I don't even know if crushed rock they could probably burrow through crushed rock. So
Okay.
if it's that bad, I mean, seriously, I see those moles all over California, but I haven't had crop loss to them. Are you seeing a lot of people that has had in their raised beds crop loss to moles? Do you know of
We
people
just
that
know
have
we
lost?
have a lot of moles. We know that they're
Okay.
in abundance here. So just like,
Okay.
just to
So
This is
be
a question
preventative.
this was a question and something I saw someone else kind of talked about. Where
yeah,
they
I mean,
put,
this is where experiential, like I said, when I'm designing, I'm looking at all that and taking that in consideration in my blueprint planning before I build. So if you're like, man, there's moles everywhere out here, you could put a garden bed out and test the theories, right? You know what I mean? Seriously, before you build out your whole garden. And then the strategy to that is some kind of screen system that's attached to your fabricated garden bed. If it's some form of mesh, metal, or even like chicken wire or whatever, you could put that barrier on your bed before you fill it with your compost. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I have never. I mean, this is where it gets interesting. Like I've been in environments where people are like, oh, the deer are going to eat all that. Never happened, right? The rabbit are going to take all that out. And again, it's knowing what your pressures are and then catering to them specifically for your homestead.
we have one question here that's more of a personal question. It says, what made Santi so passionate about off-grid living and his inspiration on zoning?
Well, so I didn't want to go long-winded, and it's probably been a little bit, like I said, bunny trails. I almost died. I was big into bodybuilding, health food, and everything in the state of California. And I was working in paramedicine, and I got really sick with the digestive disease, and I almost died. And I was at 195 pounds, super muscular, and after surgery to correct this issue, dropped down to about 98 pounds, and then went all the way down to 89 pounds. And none of the conventional doctors knew how to fix this issue. And that's when I fled California to Missouri and got networked with a lot of naturopaths, nutritionists, and then learned how to garden. And that's where the passion is. I literally went through starvation in the state of California. I experienced starvation. No matter what I ate, I couldn't retain the nutrient, and I got really ill. And so it's like this forced fast where it stripped me of physical appearance, stripped me of vocation, stripped me of any platform of popularity because I no longer looked the same way I did. And then it forced me into this exodus, right? Where I was forced to walk away from the vanity of the state of California, the complacent consumerism. Shoot, I couldn't even eat with my friends and family because I couldn't even eat the foods they were eating. And so I believe by divine intervention, even through suffering, it was going to be my teacher. And that's when I met the quadriplegic man when I was 6. So I couldn't feel sorry for myself. And he taught me countercultural gardening methods that were all close to the house, easy to manage. And that's why I'm so passionate about it, because I know that whether we like it or not, we are going to be dependent on these methodologies. Right. And whether they're successful or not, they're still worth investment, because we're not going to have in the very near future, especially working in crisis response right now. I know that there's going to be great famine that's going to spread. We already see it, right? We're already seeing.
The grocery stores are almost empty as we speak.
So, but this is way back in 2006, and between 2006 and 2009, when I feel like in a way it was just a forerunner. There's many people like that. I know right now a widow that's been doing this since 1989, I think, right? And she has one of the most amazing raised bed gardens, fully off grid. But there's not a lot of generations that want to do what she's doing, right? Or to assist her on the land. Or there's not even men that want to partner because they're used to the big machines, right? So that's why I'm so passionate saying it's no longer if, it's just when now. I don't have to try to force this idea on people. People are contacting me. Obviously, I'm exhausted, so I'm not clearly communicating is like I would like to, but it's clear that this is a necessity now. And that's my passion. It's like, I don't want to see people go hungry.
With as little as we know, I can already tell that this is a necessity.
Yeah. But again, it's the necessity. I've partnered with multiple non-for-profits. Every time something is a big corporation or has a big business mindset, it gets exploited, and we basically reproduce why there's starvation in the first place, right? Because it's not necessarily a lack of arable soil right now, which is coming, but it's more so a lack of logistical distribution of the goods and services, right? So we know at any point, if logistical distribution of goods and services are cut off to any major metropolitan in the state of California or in our nation, we're going to have great lawlessness, crimes of scarcity, where we're already starting to see that happen. So it's obvious to me that the methodology cannot be this big mentality, right? Bigger is better. It's got to go back to the individual home. But then we go into even the more prepper side of, well, why would I have a garden if I could just store my food, right? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm going to buy food, and I'm not discouraging any of that, but you can see where there could be conflict, even what I share of what's even practical right now. I would say I have no desire. I've worked with men that are preppers. I'm not against any of that. I've partnered with men that are storing food in caves and things of that nature. I mean, we're talking thousands of pounds of food in caves. That's not my heart. My heart is that I think humanity is going to have to experience great suffering to the point of understanding where we are repenting and turning from our exploitation, first and foremost from consumerism. If you look at from a religious perspective, you see that even the Garden of Eden wasn't enough for man's greed, right? So from a religious perspective, from a secular perspective that may not be religious, you can say, hey, the scientific method is proving, right, from a scientific understanding that our complacent consumerism is no longer sustainable, right? So we know that there's roughly 7.9 billion people on the planet. How many people can the planet sustain? Most people don't know that. Well, the guys like the scientists, right, that are pushing a lot of the pharmaceuticals, and the guys that are, the computer brains with billions of dollars, they know this information. They openly share it. Most of them believe that the Earth can only carry 9 billion, right? The Earth has.
I also hear the different people that say that once we hit 9 billion, that we're going to also hit a rapid recession of people as well.
Yeah, well, yeah, because just like you have 30 head of cattle confined to 1 acre for a whole year, you're going to have a lot of sickness and disease and death, right? Because of mismanagement, or you're going to have some form of intervention, synthetic intervention, to keep them alive. You know what I mean? And so this is not to cause fear, but this is just conversations when I'll go from poverty environment to a hot, to very wealthy people, and the wealthy will talk about this as if it's common conversation. What makes me sad, though, is with the understanding of carry capacity is what they're doing with that knowledge. Are they the greedy farmer that are creating city environments where they can exploit the populace, encourage them to complacently consume, right? And even encourage them to get sick because it's very profitable? Or are they the kind shepherd that's taking their knowledge and making sure they educate the uneducated, right? And encouraging them to become more and more non-dependent on the system that's exploiting them. That's what's so hard in law enforcement and paramedicine is we're trained to be reactionary, right? So usually a cop responds to the crime after it's been committed, right?
Correct.
And especially now, they can't even respond. They're so overwhelmed. Or the paramedic usually responds to preventable disease, right? Or the accident that could be usually prevented. And you're starting to see all the first responders get overwhelmed. And guess what all the first responders and cops and are doing right now? They're all, the guys that I know, they're fleeing and purchasing land for their families rural. And they're calling and contacting me a lot where we're having these same dialogues because they're seeing that they don't even have the capability to push back what some religious will call tribulation. Other secular people will call the end of the world or whatever their terminology is. But so that's where my passion is saying, hey, I still believe we have a small window of grace to share this information. It's very complex, right? There's so many different methodologies and details, but if we at least sow seeds to say, hey, start thinking different, start walking away from the complacent consumerism in the city, start to purge all non-necessity, get back to the garden, and kitchen garden is a great first step, whether that's in the city or not. It starts opening your mind to where your food comes from.
Well, and it goes back to years ago when I was a kid and my brother was over my house and I was trying to cook him something for lunch. And I grabbed a box of pasta, something as simple as pasta. And he looked at me and he looked at it and said, no, I will not eat that. And I said, why not? He said, it has literal poison in it. And
Yeah.
he's like, partially hydrogenated soybean oil is poison to our bodies. And I didn't realize, well,
We
must have lost Santi. We'll see. We'll see.
We were getting really close to wrapping that up.
It's okay. Yeah. No, let me see if he
might have had battery.
Yeah. 1 second, everybody.
I'm glad you guys are really liking this information. He's super, super knowledgeable.
Yeah. So Jessica has put his link to his website in the chat here for everybody to see. I'm going to also in the Facebook page, we're going to link a lot of the pictures that he was talking about that talk about the different zones and show you how
because his website is packed with information.
Packed.
And I mean, it's packed with like the demographics and everything. And like, I mean, it's really, really detailed. So we'll try to pull out the relevant stuff from this conversation, put it in a smaller package for you guys to look at, because it can be pretty overwhelming.
Yeah, I mean, he's done his research down to the caloric intake needs of the average individual and what needs to be planted to sustain that. I mean, it's amazing.
Yeah.
And I apologize. This is my first time ever doing a interview style kind of live stream, and I wasn't as engaged talking because I was learning at the same time. I'm fascinated by everything he says, and we've had many conversations that have lasted hours. Wow, sorry about that, everyone. So this was a great live stream. I really hope everybody enjoyed this, and we will be doing this every month, where we will have a special guest on, subject matter expert
on something off grid.
On something off grid. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, all right.
We're glad you guys could all join us this evening.
Yes. Thank you so much.
And if you haven't watched this week's video yet, we put it out on Thursday instead of today.
Yeah.
So go back and check that out.
And we will see you hopefully by Sunday. We're working on some great projects this week. And remember, just keep growing.
Good night.
Good night, everyone. We love y'all.